When I entered the command center, my father-in-law, a highly decorated fleet admiral, smirked and shouted across the room, "What's your pilot nickname, Sunshine?" The entire assembly of officers erupted in laughter. I allowed a faint, cool smile to form on my lips. "It's Ghost," I said. The laughter ceased abruptly. "You don't ask for respect, you command it. You'll be attending my briefing tomorrow as a civilian observer," Cole declared during our Sunday dinner. He pushed the formal invitation across the table just as Leo was slicing the pot roast. "It's high time you saw how genuine military strategy is conducted." My two daughters were upstairs, absorbed in their homework, oblivious to the precise moment their grandfather had finally overplayed his hand. For 3 years, I had been patiently waiting for him to make this exact mistake, to believe he could humiliate me on his own territory without having any idea who I truly was. Before we proceed, if you've ever been made to feel insignificant or had your skills disregarded, consider hitting that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it helps bring these kinds of stories to those who need to hear them. All right, let's see how this unfolds. The invitation lay there, a stark white rectangle between the gravy boat and the roasted carrots, its official Naval Base Coronado letterhead gleaming under our dining room chandelier. Leo's carving knife stopped in mid-air. He understood the trap his father was setting, but he was completely unaware that I had been arranging my own pieces for this very game since the day Cole first dismissed me as an unsuitable civilian addition to the Vance family's distinguished military lineage. "That's very thoughtful of you, Dad," Leo said, his voice carefully neutral, a tone he had perfected over decades of managing his father's explosive temper. His hand found mine beneath the table, a silent squeeze intended as an apology for the public humiliation he believed was unavoidable. He couldn't have known that the invitation wasn't Cole's power move. It was my opening gambit. Cole leaned back in his chair, satisfaction radiating from the deep lines etched into his face. At 65, even dressed in a polo shirt and slacks, he exuded the unwavering authority of a man perpetually in command. His silver hair was cut with military precision, and his eyes held that icy detachment he reserved for anyone he considered beneath him. For 3 years, that had been me. Well, someone needs to comprehend what true service involves, he remarked, cutting into his roast with a deliberate, forceful gesture. All this civilian flying you do, these medical flights, it's a noble endeavor, I suppose, but it's not in the same stratosphere as military operations, a completely different world. The dismissal was a well-practiced jab, refined over countless family dinners where he had systematically undermined my career. In his version of the story, I was a glorified air taxi driver, ferrying patients from one hospital to another. He had spun this narrative so convincingly that even Leo, at times, seemed to forget the life I had led before we met, before I had traded my military call sign for a civilian tail number. My medical transport company, Angel Wing Medevac, was a small enterprise operating out of a rented hangar at the local airfield. What Cole didn't know, what I had painstakingly concealed, was that Angel Wing held clandestine contracts with several government agencies. The cover story about flying wealthy tourists on wine country tours, a tale he delighted in mocking at the officers' club, was so implausible that my business partner Chloe, a former Army Ranger who had left part of her leg in the sands of Kandahar, had even created a fake website and brochure to support it. We let Cole exist in his own fabricated reality because the truth would have shattered the pedestal of superiority he had constructed for himself. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to observe," I said, my voice soft and compliant, the tone I had perfected to protect Leo's career from his father's fury. Cole preferred his daughter-in-law to be agreeable, supportive, and largely unseen. For 3 years, I had been exactly that, even as it felt like I was erasing a fundamental part of myself. After dinner, while Leo helped with the dishes and Cole watched a documentary on naval warfare in the den, I stood at the kitchen sink, gazing at my reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back had learned to shrink, to occupy less space, to keep her opinions to herself. She wore cardigans, not flight suits. She carried a diaper bag, not a survival kit. She attended school fundraisers, not mission debriefs. But somewhere beneath that meticulously constructed facade, Major Evelyn Reed was still present. Ghost 11, the pilot who had flown directly into a hailstorm of enemy fire to extract a wounded recon team. The pilot who had earned a Distinguished Flying Cross for actions so classified they were officially a myth. The pilot who had saved 12 men in the foothills of the Tora Bora Mountains, one of whom was Cole's own brother, Daniel. Of course, Cole had no idea his son had married the very pilot who had bent the laws of physics and defied a direct order to bring his brother home. Later that night, after we returned to our modest house just off the base, I sat in my home office as Leo tucked the girls into bed. The office was deliberately ordinary. The walls were covered in family photos and my daughter's crayon drawings, a filing cabinet overflowing with school forms and utility bills. But inside a locked drawer, hidden beneath old appliance warranties and IKEA assembly manuals, was a gray dossier I had been compiling for 3 years. It contained the declassified portions of my military service record, after-action reports with entire paragraphs redacted, but which still told a compelling story. And the centerpiece, a commendation letter signed by Admiral Cole Vance himself, praising the extraordinary valor and superior airmanship of Major E. Reed during Operation Sunfire Ridge. He had never made the connection. E. Reed and Evelyn, his son's wife. The notion that the woman he'd dismissed as social deadweight could be the same pilot who'd saved his brother had simply never entered his mind. The next morning, my routine began at 05:30, as it had every day for the past 3 years. Leo's service dress uniform hung in our closet, waiting. I ironed each crease with methodical precision, used a ruler to align his ribbons, and ensured his entire appearance was flawless. Cole judged military families by their outward perfection, and I had learned to use that judgment as my own form of camouflage. On the kitchen counter, Maya and Lily's lunchboxes were prepared. Turkey and Swiss for Maya, who detested ham, a deconstructed lunch of cheese cubes and crackers for Lily, who was going through a phase of only eating foods that didn't touch. I slipped their daily notes inside, small cards with hand-drawn hearts and smiley faces, encouraging them to be brave and do their best. They would never know their mother's definition of brave involved flying a crippled helicopter through a barrage of rocket-propelled grenades. Leo found me in the kitchen at 6:15, fresh from his shower, reaching for the uniform I had laid out. He kissed my forehead, a familiar gesture that was both tender and apologetic. He knew what his father had planned for the briefing. He had argued with Cole, tried to talk him out of it, but once the Admiral set a course, there was no altering it. "You don't have to go, Evie," he said softly, pinning on his ribbons. "I can tell him you're not feeling well, that the girls have something." "It's all right," I replied, pouring coffee into the thermos he had carried since his days at Annapolis. "Your father wants to teach me a lesson about real military operations. Who knows, maybe I'll learn something." The words tasted like acid, but my face remained a placid mask. Leo studied me, searching for the flicker of anger he knew I was entitled to feel, but I had become an expert at hiding my true self from the Vance men. It was, for a long time, the only way to maintain peace. At 06:45, I kissed the girls goodbye at the breakfast table. Maya was already engrossed in a book about wolves, while Lily was frowning at a page of fractions. "Mom, why are you wearing your fancy clothes?" Lily asked, her eyes taking in my tailored slacks and blazer, a stark contrast to my usual jeans and comfortable shirt. "Just a meeting on the base, sweetie," I told her, smoothing her dark hair, a perfect replica of Leo's. They had no reason to believe this Tuesday was any different, no idea that their mother was about to walk directly into a planned ambush. The drive to Naval Base Coronado was a 20-minute crawl through the predictable chaos of morning traffic. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, lit up at a stoplight. A text from Leo. Dad was in a strange mood at breakfast, kept going on about putting people in their place. Think he's planning to chew out Jenkins. Just be careful. Poor Leo, still assuming his father's venom was aimed at some unfortunate junior officer, completely oblivious to the fact that the primary target had always been me. I had watched Cole employ this tactic for years. The public reprimand, the veiled threat, the way he could dismantle someone's career while maintaining a facade of professional objectivity. Leo had grown up in that shadow, learning to read his father's moods but unable to see the patterns when they were directed at someone Cole deemed insignificant. I tapped out a quick reply at the next red light. Thanks for the heads up. Love you. Short, simple, revealing nothing. The base gates rose ahead, the guards checking IDs with the practiced boredom of their profession. My civilian contractor ID received a second glance, then a wave-through. I had held that pass for 2 years, a consultant on medevac logistics and protocols, though Cole had somehow ensured that fact never circulated in his social circles. In the visitor lot, I parked and was gathering my belongings when I saw a familiar face. Laura Diaz, wife of Commander Diaz, was struggling with grocery bags next to her minivan. She was the quintessential senior officer's wife, a woman who had mastered the delicate art of the base's social hierarchy. "Evelyn," she called out, a note of carefully modulated sympathy in her voice. She abandoned her groceries and hurried over, her expression a mixture of pity and warning. "I was surprised to hear you'd be here today. Cole invited me to observe the briefing," I said, my voice level, but I could read the truth in her eyes. Laura glanced around the parking lot, then leaned in close. "He's been talking about it at the officers' club for a week," she whispered. "My husband, Marco, came home last night and said your father-in-law was planning to," I think his words were, "demonstrate the proper context for his son's wife." The confirmation landed without any real shock. Cole had been promoting this event, building an audience for my takedown, ensuring there were plenty of witnesses for whatever lesson he was about to impart. The one thing he hadn't considered was that his target had been preparing for this day far longer than he had. "Thank you for the warning, Laura," I said, and I meant it. She was risking Cole's wrath by telling me this, a small but significant act of solidarity. "Just be ready," Laura said, giving my arm a squeeze. "That man has ended careers for far less than whatever he thinks you've done to the family name." Inside the administration building, the air conditioning was a frigid blast against the California heat. I walked to the security desk, where a young petty officer was poring over a clipboard. "Civilian consultant for Admiral Vance's briefing," I stated, sliding my ID across the polished countertop. He glanced at my ID, then his list, then back at my ID, his brow furrowed in confusion. He ran his finger down the list of names a second time. "Ma'am, you're on the list, but—" He paused, visibly struggling with how to phrase his next question. "It says civilian consultant, but there's a note here that you're the Admiral's daughter-in-law. Should I issue a visitor pass, or—" "A visitor badge is correct," I said, watching him wrestle with the contradiction. "I'm here in a professional capacity." The confusion on his face deepened, but he was too well trained to argue. He printed a badge with the words, "Civilian Consultant" in bold letters and handed it to me with directions to the third-floor conference room. As I clipped it to my blazer, I overheard 2 lieutenants waiting for the elevator. "Heard the Admiral has something special planned for the briefing today," one of them said. "Something about showing the difference between actual service and civilian wannabes. Whatever it is, I'm just glad it's not me," the other replied, jabbing the elevator button. "Vance has been on a rampage all week. Spent 20 minutes yesterday lecturing us on how civilian contractors are diluting the warrior ethos." They saw me approach and fell silent, offering me stiff, polite nods as they stepped into the elevator. I waited for the next one, using the brief moment alone to center myself. The third-floor ladies' room was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing over the sterile white tiles. I looked at myself in the mirror. I saw the woman I had allowed Cole's constant pressure to create, the slight slump in my shoulders, a subconscious effort to make myself smaller in his presence, the softer, more questioning tone I had adopted. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back into their natural, confident alignment. The door opened and Lieutenant Kennedy, one of the female officers from the elevator, walked in. She gave me a polite nod, then did a subtle double take, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, though she couldn't quite place me. The walk to Conference Room B felt a mile long. The hallway was a shrine to naval history, lined with photos of decorated admirals and legendary warships. My heels clicked on the polished linoleum, each step a drumbeat marching me closer to Cole's trap. The door was open, and the low rumble of pre-meeting chatter spilled out. I paused on the threshold, absorbing the scene. The room was tiered, filled with more than 40 officers in their dress whites, a sea of institutional authority. Their conversations were a mix of technical jargon and easy laughter, the sound of men who knew they belonged. The rumble stuttered for a beat as I stepped inside. A ripple went through the room as they registered my presence. A civilian, a woman. Then the noise resumed, a little louder this time, as faces lit up with recognition. I was the Admiral's problematic daughter-in-law, the one who didn't get it. Commander Diaz in the front row saw me, and his eyes widened. No doubt he was remembering his wife's warning from the parking lot. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, a tiny gesture that communicated he knew what was coming, disapproved, but wasn't about to torpedo his career by intervening. I found a seat in the 5th row, visible enough for the planned humiliation, but not so forward as to seem defiant. No one spoke to me, but I felt their gazes, curious and speculative. 2 rows ahead, I heard Captain Matthews complaining to a colleague about helicopter maintenance schedules and logistical bottlenecks. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They were discussing the very logistics I had managed flawlessly for over a decade. Yet to them, I was just Leo's wife, a woman who flew a little on the weekends. At 08:58, an institutional hush fell over the room. Papers were squared away, coffee cups set down. At precisely 0900, as if on cue, Cole strode in. His uniform wasn't just perfect, it was a weapon. His presence sucked the air out of the room, demanding and receiving absolute attention. His eyes found mine instantly, a flash of predatory victory in them. He savored the moment, the corners of his mouth tilting up in a smile only I could recognize as pure malice. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with a command tone that automatically straightened spines. "And ladies," he added with a perfunctory nod toward Lieutenant Kennedy and her colleague, an acknowledgement that somehow managed to diminish them. The presentation began. Slides of deployment statistics and readiness charts clicked by. Cole was in his element, a master of the military briefing, conveying complex data with cold, efficient precision. For 30 minutes I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, playing the role of the attentive but out-of-her-depth civilian. He was mid-sentence discussing extraction protocols under adverse weather when he paused. The break was so deliberate that every single person in the room focused on him. He turned away from the screen, his expression shifting into something that might look paternal to the uninitiated. His gaze swept the room before locking onto me like a targeting laser. "Actually, before we continue this discussion on tactical aviation," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "I want to acknowledge our special guest." Every head swiveled in my direction. More than 40 pairs of eyes followed his grand, patronizing gesture. "My daughter-in-law, Evelyn, has joined us today," he announced. The words daughter-in-law weighted with condescension. "She's a pilot herself, you know. Sightseeing tours, I believe. Sunset flights over the vineyards. Maybe she can learn a thing or two about how real military aviators operate." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the junior officers. Cole's smile widened, giving them permission. "Tell me, Evelyn," he said, his voice now sickly sweet. "What's your call sign? Do civilian pilots even use those? What do they call you, Sunshine?" Princess? The room exploded. The tentative chuckles became a wave of unrestrained laughter. Officers were slapping their knees, elbowing their neighbors. It was the laughter of relief. They weren't the target. Someone else was on the sacrificial altar, and they could join in from a safe distance. The sound washed over me, distant and clinical. I let them have their moment, letting the sound peak. Then I moved. I stood up slowly, uncoiling to my full height. My spine straightened, my shoulders squared. The change was subtle but absolute, like shedding a costume I'd worn for too long. The laughter began to falter. My hands were steady at my sides as I met Cole's smug gaze. No deference, no submission. Just the calm, unwavering stare I had perfected in 100 pre-flight briefings where the math said we shouldn't go, but lives were on the line. It's Ghost. The two words sliced through the lingering laughter with the precision of a laser-guided bomb. The effect was immediate. Laughter died in throats. Commander Diaz, who had been sipping his coffee, choked, the sound of his gasp unnaturally loud in the sudden, absolute silence. He coughed and managed to sputter a single word that changed the entire dynamic of the room. Ghost. Because every aviator in that room, every operator, knew the legend of Ghost 11, the pilot from Operation Sunfire Ridge. They'd all heard the stories, whispered in ready rooms and retold over beers, of the pilot who did what couldn't be done, who defied orders in physics to bring a team home. But not one of them had ever connected that ghost to the Admiral's quiet, unassuming daughter-in-law. Lieutenant Kennedy's hand flew to her mouth. Captain Matthews' jaw hung slack. In the third row, a young ensign dropped his pen, and the clatter on the floor sounded like a gunshot. Cole's smile flickered, a crack in his armor of certainty. October, 2017. Kandahar Province, I said, my voice clinically calm. The truth needed no volume. A dozen men extracted under overwhelming fire. Our primary hydraulics were gone, courtesy of an enemy RPG. My co-pilot, Captain Miller, was unconscious, bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, while I flew with one hand on the stick and the other trying to keep the backup systems from frying. The room was so still I could hear the hum of the ventilation system. Cole was gripping the podium, his knuckles white. The extraction point was compromised. The entire recon team was pinned down, and we were taking fire from elevated positions on 3 sides, including Master Sergeant Daniel Vance. The name hit Cole like a physical blow. He actually stumbled, bracing himself on the podium. Around the room, a wave of understanding passed between the officers. Daniel Vance, the Admiral's brother, a decorated operator who died in a later engagement, but not before Sunfire Ridge had granted him 2 more years of life. "Your brother, Admiral," I said, my voice level. He was bleeding out from a gunshot wound to the leg when we got him on board. He begged me not to let him die before he could see his newborn daughter. He had a picture of her taped to the inside of his helmet. "Oh my God," someone whispered from the back. I saw another officer pull out his phone, probably frantically searching for declassified reports on Sunfire Ridge, trying to reconcile the impossible truth. I flew that bird back with half my control surfaces shot to hell and my co-pilot bleeding out next to me. The helicopter was shaking itself to pieces. My crew chief dislocated his shoulder just trying to lay down covering fire. We counted 21 holes in the fuselage later. It's a miracle we didn't disintegrate in midair. Cole's face had gone from smug to shocked to a pasty grayish white. His grand public humiliation was imploding, revealing a truth far uglier than simple cruelty. He had spent 3 years belittling the very person who had saved his brother. "Daniel got to meet his daughter because I refused to let him die on my watch," I said. 2 years later, just before his final deployment, he sent me a letter. He wanted someone to know the full story of that night, about the command decisions that nearly got all of us killed before we even lifted off. Whispers erupted. Sunfire Ridge. It was her. Impossible. Commander Diaz, now recovered, was staring at me with dawning, absolute reverence. He knew. He'd been there. I calmly pulled out my own phone, swiping to a PDF I'd kept saved for this very occasion. The screen showed the document's header: Operation Sunfire Ridge, After Action Report, Declassified. The declassified report is a fascinating read, Admiral, I said, holding up the phone, especially the part about the command decisions made that night. 3 separate abort recommendations from the flight meteorologist, all 3 personally overruled by you. Cole was now holding onto the podium, not for emphasis, but for physical support. You pushed the mission forward to stay on your precious timeline, against all pilot safety protocols. The report notes, and I'm quoting here, "Command's insistence on immediate launch despite severe weather advisories and known enemy anti-air capability created an unacceptable level of risk for both the air crew and the ground team." That's the polite, official way of saying your arrogance almost killed your own brother. The silence that followed was total. 43 officers sat frozen, witnesses to a type of public execution they had never imagined. They came for a spectacle, and they were getting one. Just not the one they'd been promised. A captain in the second row shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking. "If you're Ghost 11, then you're the one who—" He stopped, looking from me to Cole, torn. 2 months ago, my partner Chloe had come into my office, her face grim. Her old contacts in military intelligence had dug up something. Cole hadn't just been ignorant of my role in saving his brother. He'd actively suppressed the full story of Daniel's survival, because admitting Daniel lived meant admitting his own catastrophic failure in judgment. I reached into my blazer and pulled out a folded, worn piece of paper. "Admiral Vance," I said, my voice sharp and formal, "your own commendation letter praised Major E. Reed for exceptional courage in the face of impossible odds. You called this pilot a credit to naval aviation and personally recommended me for the Distinguished Flying Cross." I unfolded the letter. The sound of the paper crackling seemed to echo in the silent room. And yet, for 3 years, you've mocked that same pilot at family gatherings. You introduced me as Linda to a visiting general at last year's Navy ball, a petty little cruelty to show how little I mattered. You told Captain Matthews that I'd trapped your son, that Leo could have married into a proper military family. Commander Diaz flinched. These weren't secrets. But now, they were being aired in the context of a devastating new truth. 6 months before he died, Daniel came to see me, I said, my voice dropping slightly. He found me through old service records, showed up at my hangar one afternoon. He said he needed to thank me, but that wasn't the real reason. Cole's breathing was now a series of shallow, ragged gasps. I saw his eyes dart toward the exit, but there was no escape. He said he couldn't forgive you for gambling with a dozen lives just to keep your mission record spotless. Those were his words, Admiral. He said the guilt was eating you alive, turning you into a bitter, angry man who lashed out at anyone who reminded you of that night, especially me, because I was the living, breathing proof that your judgment was wrong. I held up Daniel's letter. He wanted someone to know the truth. He had a premonition about his next deployment. He was right. Should I read his exact words, Admiral? I didn't wait for an answer. If something happens to me, I read, my voice steady, someone needs to know about Cole's pattern. Sunfire Ridge wasn't a one-off. Operation Granite Peak in 2016. 6 dead because he ignored intel about an ambush. Operation Sea Serpent in 2017, a helicopter crash that killed 3 because he pushed them to fly with documented equipment failures. He buries the reports, calls in favors, and good men and women keep dying for his reputation. The room erupted, not with laughter, but with shocked curses and urgent, angry whispers. Captain Matthews was typing furiously on his phone, searching for Operation Granite Peak. He'd find the sanitized public report, but now he knew to look for what was missing. That's enough. Cole rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "That's classified." "Not anymore," I cut in, holding up my phone. "Sunfire Ridge was declassified 6 months ago. Daniel's letter is personal correspondence. And those other operations you buried? I hear the Inspector General's office is taking a new interest in investigating patterns of command failure, especially when they're corroborated by a decorated, deceased operator with no reason to lie. This was no longer about family drama. This was about systemic failure, about lives lost and a cover-up that rotted the very core of military integrity, and every officer in that room knew it. The silence was broken by Commander Diaz pushing back his chair. He stood, a big man who suddenly looked burdened and small. "I need to say something," he began, his voice shaking. He looked at me, then at Cole. I was there. Sunfire Ridge. I was one of the men on the ground. A collective gasp went through the room. Major Reed. Ghost. She saved my life. I was hit. Shrapnel in my chest. The medic said I wouldn't make it without immediate evac, but Admiral Vance, he swallowed hard. He wanted us to hold our position, said the risk to aviation assets was too high. Cole's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "She came anyway," Diaz said, his eyes locked on mine. "Flew through a storm of steel that should have torn her aircraft apart. I remember lying on the floor of that helo, my blood all over the deck, watching her wrestle the controls, and she just kept flying, like our lives mattered more than hers. When we got back, the after-action report was buried. Admiral Vance took credit for a successful extraction in his fitness reports and used it to secure this command, but the success was hers. We lived because she defied his orders." Before the shock could settle, Captain Matthews stood. "Operation Granite Peak, 2016, he said, his voice grim. "I lost 2 of my best men because Admiral Vance insisted we proceed despite faulty intel. The investigation blamed unforeseeable enemy movement." We knew it was a lie. Another officer stood, Operation Sea Serpent. He overruled 3 weather delays. We lost a bird and 3 crew. The official report cited pilot error. One by one they stood. A dam of silence and fear, built over years, had broken. Story after story poured out, painting a portrait of a commander who valued statistics over people, his reputation over their lives. My phone buzzed. A text from Chloe. "It's done. Every major news outlet has the files. CNN is calling. You've got about 20 minutes before this is national news." I hadn't asked her to do it, but Chloe had watched Cole's dismissal eat away at me for 3 years. She had made her own command decision. The room's attention snapped to the front, where Ensign Miller, Cole's young aide, had stood up. His face was pale, his voice trembling. "Last week, Admiral Vance ordered me to shred a series of documents related to Sunfire Ridge," he confessed, the words tumbling out. "Original communications, weather charts, recordings of the abort recommendations. He said it was housekeeping. I couldn't do it. My father flew search and rescue. He taught me integrity is more important than rank. I copied everything. I submitted it to the Inspector General's office yesterday morning. They confirmed receipt at 0800 today." The sound Cole made was a strangled gasp. He staggered back, away from the podium, his entire world collapsing in real time. The room erupted not in anger but in applause. It started with one officer, then another, until the entire room was standing, clapping for the young ensign who had chosen integrity over his career. Through it all, I stood still, the weight of 3 years finally lifting. This wasn't about revenge, it was a reckoning. As the applause died down, Cole finally spoke, his voice a broken whisper. "It's all true. You saved Daniel, and I hated you for it, because every time I looked at you, I saw my own failure." He looked at me, his eyes hollow. "I threatened Leo's career, told him you needed to be quiet, to be small, because your light cast a shadow on my own cowardice." At that, a new round of applause began. It was slow, deliberate, led by Lieutenant Kennedy. Commander Diaz joined in, then Captain Matthews. One by one, every officer rose, giving a standing ovation not to me but to the truth itself. Cole stood frozen, watching his legacy turn to ash. His phone was lighting up nonstop. The Pentagon was calling. I remained seated for a moment, then stood one last time. "There's one more thing, Admiral," I said, and the room fell silent again. "That sightseeing company you mock? Angel Wing Medevac?" I pulled up one last document on my phone, a contract header with a very specific, very classified DoD seal. We hold 3 black-level contracts. We run medevac missions in non-permissive environments, places where soldiers are doing jobs that don't officially exist. In the last 3 years, while playing with helicopters, I've flown more combat-adjacent hours than most active-duty pilots in this room. A fresh wave of shock rippled through the officers. The quiet, diminished housewife they thought they knew was a ghost in more ways than one. And then Cole did something no one expected. With trembling fingers, he began to unpin his ribbons, the Bronze Star, the Legion of Merit, the medals that had defined him. He placed them neatly on the podium, his last act of military precision. His uniform now looked bare, his armor gone. He looked at me, his face a mask of utter defeat. "You are the officer I always pretended to be," he said. And with that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving his career, his reputation, and his honor behind on the podium. The ribbons lay there, glinting under the harsh, fluorescent lights. For several minutes, no one moved. Then, one by one, the officers began to file out, many stopping to shake my hand, their eyes filled with a new, profound respect. Lieutenant Kennedy pressed a card into my hand. "When you're ready to tell the full story," she said, "the real one." Leo burst through the doors an hour later, his face a storm of pride, fury, and relief. He crossed the room and pulled me into his arms. "I've always known who you were, Evie," he whispered. "Not the details, but I knew. I've watched you shrink for 3 years, and it's been killing me." He pulled back, tears in his eyes. "I have a file, recordings, emails. I was ready to resign my commission. I wasn't going to let him break you." 6 months later, I stood before a military review board. I didn't argue for Cole's destruction. I argued for his redemption. "Make him a cautionary tale," I told them. "Force him to teach ethics at the academy. Make him use his own failures as the curriculum." They agreed. Cole would retire and spend his remaining years teaching young officers how arrogance costs lives. The girls finally learned the truth when Maya found a news article online. "Mom, is this you?" she asked, her eyes wide. I sat them down at our kitchen table. "Yes," I said, "that's me." Lily, ever direct, asked, "Why did you hide it?" "Because sometimes," I explained, "the greatest strength isn't showing your power. It's knowing when to use it. I was protecting our peace. But there comes a time when hiding your light does a disservice to everyone. My relationship with Cole is not warm, but it is honest. He now introduces me as Major Reed, the woman who saved my brother and my honor. I am back to flying, my real name on my flight suit. Angel Wing has expanded, hiring other pilots, many of them women who know what it feels like to be underestimated. The respect I now command was never given to me. It was always mine. I just had to choose the right moment to claim it. If this story of reclaimed identity and earned respect moved you, make sure to hit that like button. My favorite part was when Ensign Miller revealed he'd sent the files to the Inspector General. What was the most powerful moment for you? Let me know in the comments below. And for more incredible stories of truth coming to light, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what's next. End of story.